Today's Gospel in the fourth Sunday in Ordinary Time is interesting in the sense that it presents a series of inconsistencies. For instance, last week we saw Jesus preaching in Nazareth at the beginning of his ministry in Galilee according to the Gospel of Luke. He is preaching at the synagogue, and as we see today at the beginning of the Gospel, which is what happens right after what we read last week, the people are happy with what Jesus said. They are even admiring him by the words of grace coming from his mouth. Then all of a sudden they abruptly change their attitude. They turn against Jesus up to the point of trying to kill him. Why did that happen? Another interesting thing we see is that according to Luke, when Jesus begins his ministry in Galilee, he begins by doing so in Nazareth, preaching at the synagogue. And then what we find next in the text is that Jesus goes to Capernaum. Yet, when Jesus is defending himself, so to speak, at the synagogue, he brings up the many things he did in Capernaum. Not one thing, but the many things he did in Capernaum. If it was many, that means before he went to Nazareth, he actually spent a good amount of time in Capernaum. But why is it then that according to Luke, Jesus began his ministry in Galilee in Nazareth and not in Capernaum? Another interesting inconsistency we find is a drought that involves Elijah. We can see this in the first book of Kings. And according to Jesus, that drought lasted 3 years and 6 months. But when we read that passage in the first book of Kings, we find that the drought lasted actually 3 years. Why did Jesus add 6 months to it? Another inconsistency. Well, let's go one by one. The first thing we see is that people are praising Jesus first, and then all of a sudden they turn against him. What we find here is the result of a later addition to the text of the Gospel according to Luke. The way Luke develops his Gospel narrative is as a long itinerary from Galilee to Jerusalem, where Jesus is going to die. 2 different episodes happened in Nazareth. The first time Jesus preached at the synagogue, he read that passage from Isaiah that we read last week, and he acknowledges he is the Messiah, and people like that. But then, on a different occasion, for some reason, people began doubting about Jesus, and that's when they decided to kill him. Because you cannot explain that abrupt change in the attitude of the people next to Jesus at the synagogue. But on a later edition, somebody, maybe Luke or maybe some other editor, clipped that text, that pericope, in which people are against Jesus, and juxtaposed it to the first pericope that happened in Nazareth. And by doing this, he presents a whole episode, even though it doesn't make sense, but all together at Nazareth. So that for the purpose of developing that itinerary, everything that happened at Nazareth is presented together, and then the trip continues to Capernaum and so on. This could be understood as a biblical intercalation or a biblical juxtaposition, in which 2 texts, 2 separate pericopes, are put next to a different one, simply for the sake of grouping things in Nazareth in this case. And that explains the first inconsistency. Then the second inconsistency is the one about the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Nazareth or in Capernaum. And that perhaps has to do with the first one. Perhaps what happened is that Jesus went to Nazareth first. People liked what he said at the synagogue. They maybe were admired, and maybe they believed even that he was indeed the Messiah. Then he went to Capernaum, spent a good amount of time in Capernaum, and then he went back to Nazareth, and for whatever reason people were mad at him this time. And that's why Jesus, on this second pericope, talks about what happened at Capernaum and the many things he did at Capernaum. But once again, when that second pericope was clipped and juxtaposed to the first, then these inconsistencies begin to make sense. That doesn't, of course, change the fact that Jesus acknowledged himself as the Messiah first, and then at some point people rejected him. Nemo profeta in patria, Jesus said. Nobody is welcomed as a prophet in the land of his parents. And to make the point, Jesus recalls 2 episodes, the first one of Elijah, the second one of Elisha. And talking about Elijah, he recalls that drought that, according to the book of Kings, lasted 3 years. But Jesus says it lasted 3 years and 6 months. He added half a year. Why is that? Well, when you consider 3.5, 3.5, you can write this number as the result of the addition of 1 plus 2 plus a half. 1 plus 2 plus 1 half equals 3.5. This number is really interesting because when we read the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament, we find this number on different occasions. There is a pericope that talks about a woman clothed with the sun, and at some point she goes to the desert because she is persecuted, and she goes to the desert, according to the book of Revelation, she goes there for 1206 days. 1206 days. There is a previous pericope in the book of Revelation that talks about 7 trumpets. One of the trumpets makes a reference of 42 months of persecution. Well, if you divide 1206 days into months, they become 42 months. But now, if you convert those 42 months into years, they become 3 years and a half. The interesting thing about this woman clothed with the sun is that she is taken to the desert for 1206 days. But then it is said that once in the desert, she is fed during 1 time, 2 times, and half of a time. 1 time, 2 times, and half of a time, which is the same as 1 year plus 2 years plus half a year, which equals the 3 years and 6 months that Jesus spoke of when he recalled that drought in the first book of Kings. So instead of using the 3 years that are recorded in the first book of Kings, Jesus prefers to use an apocalyptic number. An apocalyptic number that actually means persecution. And indeed, he feels persecuted at that time. And he is truly persecuted up to the point that people will take him to the top of a cliff to try to kill him. Now, the book of Revelation was written decades after Jesus died. So where did he get this apocalyptic number from? The interesting thing is that the apocalyptic writing of the book of Revelation bases many of its symbols from the first apocalyptic book that was written, and it was written around 2 centuries before the birth of Jesus, and it was written by Prophet Daniel. Prophet Daniel himself speaks of 1 time, 2 times, and half of a time, talking about persecution. So there is a connection between these 3 years and 6 months that Jesus is talking about, and the book of Revelation and the apocalypse of Prophet Daniel, in the sense that it is a number that represents persecution. Jesus feels persecuted, very persecuted, when he's facing all these people, and he realizes that nemo profeta in patria. They are not going to welcome him as a prophet anymore, and they are going to try to kill him. These words of Jesus in the end are directed to these people locally at Nazareth, but ultimately they are directed at the full people of God, which will ultimately reject him and bring him to death in Jerusalem. Interesting to notice these inconsistencies, but it is even more interesting to see how everything begins to make sense once we make a narrative analysis of this pericope of the Gospel according to Luke and its connection to other books in the Bible, such as the first book of Kings, the book of Revelation, and the book of Daniel. May God bless you all. Be passionate about our faith.